Welcome to the Curiosity Crisis. We challenge ourselves to explore the world of business, tech, investing, and science. Get curious and be part of the journey as we discuss, challenge, and learn.
Home solar, batteries, and virtual power plants, or VPPs, are emerging as some of the most popular energy innovations in recent years. Some listeners will be very unfamiliar with the concept of a virtual power plant, and will want to go through how they will potentially change our energy situation in the future. This will be the final installment in a micro-series tackling different parts of the energy transition. We want to delve into what all the fuss is about. What is a virtual power plant? How do they work? Why are they gaining popularity? And what they promise for our energy future. Kush, good to see you. Good to chat again.
It's good to be back. Another episode just between you and I, Luke, and delving into something that we're both pretty excited by and passionate about. So keen to get going.
Yeah, I'm excited to kind of bookend this series that we've been working on. I think it's done really well. We've really enjoyed going through it. So I think this is definitely one of the most exciting ones out of the series as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm keen to get deep into it.
So let's kick it off. What's been keeping you curious, Kush?
Actually, what's been keeping me curious is Southeast Asia. I've never traveled there properly, but I really want to go and do a few different things. And I know it's a land of many opportunities. I'm into my climbing and hiking and water-based activities, so keen to learn to dive and snorkel. So doing a lot of research out there and getting very, very excited. And it's kind of it's nice because when you're busy and caught up in the grind, to think about like a holiday like that would be it is lots of fun. So that's keeping me quite curious.
Nice.
Travel.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about you?
Yeah, mine's the reverse carry trade in Japan. What happened with that and their central bank, and just kind of like what's going to happen. I think it's a really interesting time, less personal. I've been really keeping track of macroeconomics at the moment. I'm really fascinated by what's happening in macroeconomics, and I think it's really cool to be living through what will probably be a historical event. So yeah, I've just been like trying to keep track of what's going on, and obviously it's impossible to predict the future, but it's really fun to see, different evidence pointing to different things. So yeah, that's what I've been looking at.
Do you have a very quick elevator pitch as to what's happening in Japan and what it means?
Yeah, I mean, quickly, the interest rates in Japan have been stupidly low for decades. And essentially, their reserve bank was just buying back the yen, which was increasing its price because it was slowly weakening, right? And what would happen is people would borrow money in Japan because of the low interest rate and then buy something that would potentially grow. So something in the US, for example. And the idea was you get growth there, but you also get the super low interest rate for the borrowed money, so you can do it with huge amounts of money. And essentially, they increased their interest rates, which just completely destroyed that strategy of investing, and it wiped out over $1 trillion from the market, like super, super fast. And yeah, it's just really interesting. And then they said that they wouldn't do it again, but you can't really trust what a reserve bank says. And so there's all these things. So yeah, really interesting situation there. Getting into our final episode of Energy Transition, what is a VPP? How does it work? Do you want to just run through it for a listener who has no idea what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do understand that it sounds like a complex term. It sounds pretty techy, but essentially a virtual power plant is a network of distributed home-based or consumer-side-based energy resources like solar panels and batteries that are connected and managed centrally. So these resources collectively provide power to the grid, offering stability and efficiency, obviously power and some other services that we can talk about a little bit later. And the way to think about it is as an orchestration. So they're centrally managed. So a central conductor, for example, tells all the batteries when to go at one point. And the point of that is, there's lots of these different resources around the grid, around your neighborhood, around a city, for example. Lots of houses these days have solar panels. There's increasing amounts of batteries behind residential or business sites. And really speaking, there's lots of these resources out there. So if you aggregate them, you pool them all together, and it's conducted or orchestrated really well, it might actually replace the need for a big power plant because you're using all the small stuff that's already there really effectively and all together. So it's just important to understand that the aggregate capacity of all of these sources out there is quite big. So there's a huge challenge, but a huge opportunity to tap into them and do it all together. The virtual side of it is, they're all distributed. So virtually some central conductor taps into them and orchestrates them. So what are the benefits of joining a VPP? Like, why would anybody with a solar or batteries ever consider joining one?
Yeah, so like all things, you have to incentivize participation. So in this scenario, there is financial incentive. So you reduce your electricity bill, you earn incentives from the excess energy that you supply to the grid. Because traditionally with solar, you consume what you need and any excess gets pulled from the grid. And then when you're not using anything and you have excess, you sell it back to the grid. But the thing is, you sell it for such a small amount of money. It's a fraction of what you actually are paying for every time you pull from the grid. And the ideal scenario with a VPP is that you incorporate a battery, right? So then you have this distributed system of batteries as well, which means that none of that energy is essentially wasted financially because you're still getting that cheap generation that someone else can consume. And so it kind of works out for everyone who's a participant. So everyone is getting that cheaper price. So that's kind of the way that they financially incentivize it. But also there's other incentives because you end up making the grid more resilient, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later in the episode. And the other thing is the sustainability side of it. So you're really helping out everyone. It's net benefit, but then there's also that financial incentive. So other than that, you can also program these things to use energy at their cheapest. Because they do have smarts, you can attach smart systems to these. And, they're quite new. But the advantage there is that things like heating a pool or, really long-term energy consumption things, you can really be smart about the way that you want to program these things and really optimize kind of your use of electricity. And so I think, that smart devices connection can be a real big benefit. And the other one is electric vehicles, which you can use both sides of that with an EV being used as a battery to participate as a VPP in that system, or you can use it for charging your charging your electric vehicle, at lowest cost times. So there's kind of a lot of things that lead into why you would want to participate.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about the electric vehicles a little bit later because that's very exciting and very new in terms of development. But essentially, with a VPP, you're trying to make the most of energy when it's available and cheap, for example, from your solar, or you're trying to optimize to pay the least amount because you have the flexibility with, whatever your controllable loads or your schedulable loads with your smarts are, or discharging the battery to use your cheap free solar from the daytime instead of buying energy from your retailer at the peak time in the evening. So there is a few things that you can really game, and that's sort of the name of it.
Yeah, so kind of pivoting into the more technical aspects of it, Kush, are you able to kind of, explain the off-grid piece? So, you think about being in one of these VPPs, it sounds like you're isolated from the grid. You're your own little grid. You don't need anything else. So how does that work? And is that true? Are you actually off the grid with these solar and batteries?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's kind of fun to have a look at. So, traditionally, you're a home or a business and you have to rely on the big broad grid to generate electricity and provide it to you when you need it. One of the benefits that attracts people to a VPP is that you have your own source of generation and energy. So I did some back of the envelope calculations, and this is a bit of fun, but what I got to, and there's caveats to this, is that theoretically you can be off the grid. So I'm doing a case study in Australia just because that's some of the information that I had available to me. But CSIRO, the peak scientific body in Australia, publishes some data and some studies around how we use energy here. So I found that the average home load across a day without solar attached to a home is about 17 kilowatt hours. So kilowatt hours is a measure of how much energy you use. So the average home solar size is 5.7 kilowatts. So that's just how big the size is, how much energy it can output at one time. But the average home solar daily production was 20.5 kilowatt hours. So that's actually more than how much you'd use across a day. So then if you take a home battery and you put it on there, because obviously, that 17 kilowatt hours that a home uses is across the whole day, not only when the sun's shining. So you chuck a home battery in on that. And the example that I'm using is a Powerwall, because it's the most popular, or the most front of mind, I suppose. A Tesla Powerwall, which is a 13.5 kilowatt hour size. So if you put everything that you didn't use from the solar production in the day into that battery, you should be able to get through an average, and obviously this is average, not the stretch cases in winter and summer and stuff like that. You should be able to get through your day, because at any given time, the average peak draw was only about 2 kilowatts. So in terms of how much you have in your battery, that should be able to get through those peak periods in the evening when there is no sun shining. So anyway, that's just some back of the envelope calcs to say, on an average day as part of this research, you should be able to get through with your home solar and battery.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is important to obviously remember that, on cloudy days, you're going to get less energy from your solar panels. They might still produce some, and then the batteries can store this excess use, but during these low production periods, if you're drawing from the battery every night, then there is a chance that they go empty. And obviously you could charge it from the grid, but that defeats the purpose of being off-grid, in inverted commas. An example of that is winter, when you don't get much sun across a week, you can't charge your battery from the solar panels. So this is why you're still obviously connected to the grid, and you can buy energy from your retailer. But
so summarizing, like theoretically, if you're a participant in a VPP, you and all of those other people in your suburb or whatever, you could be off-grid, theoretically. But in reality, you're not quite. But you end up helping net everyone.
Yeah, it's true. And then the other thing is, like, okay, you're not off-grid and you still need to pull from the bigger system, but, like, you significantly could reduce it, you know what I mean? Like, across most of the seasons, if you're in a sunny place, you're getting a lot of energy from the sun, and while you're not completely off-grid, you're probably reducing it by, like, 50, 60, 70, 80%, which is a lot. And that's pretty, that's not negligible.
Yeah, definitely.
So talking about, like, grids and sort of being off the grid, in terms of the broader network that we have, that we're all being connected to, how do virtual power plants help increase grid resilience?
Yeah, so we mentioned this before, about how if you are a participant, you help out the grid. And obviously all energy markets are not created equal. They work slightly differently. But Australia is a case study. That's where we're based. And something that we do is we split our grid up into our spot market, and there's another thing called an FCAS market. And essentially, that is your grid frequency. And you're able to increase that stability because you can help out in terms of that market. And additionally, you're not adding to network constraints. So let's say that your area required more energy. You'd have to transmit that energy from wherever it's produced. But one advantage is you don't need to do that because you're self-sufficient in your little microgrid or your little VPP. And so if you had multiple of these, you end up reducing the net kind of... The load's the same, but the transmission factor does not need to be required anywhere near to the same extent, right? You're not having to move all this energy across the grid as much. So that's really important. And what this means is you have these kind of, like, you're resilient to power outages. You reduce these network constraints, and your energy price fluctuations don't affect you either. So you're taking a chunk of load that no longer contributes to your price because you're self-sufficient in that your own production and your own consumption of electricity. So when we're talking about grid investment, we look at, like, what power lines need to be created and how to navigate, like, all these different people that require this energy. And with a VPP, that is, again, like, it's self-sufficient, right? Like, it's set up for itself. You don't need the additional investment in terms of transmission, etc. So you make your grid resilient in a multitude of ways. But I think the big thing is kind of like that network effect. So, like, a single VPP is not going to change the overall grid. But if you had multiple of them throughout your network, the effects continue to compound and compound. And it reduces the investment involved. It helps with power outages. It would even change the price of electricity. It would do a number of things. So the potential for influence is actually really high.
So I think just to add on that as well, like a simple way to bring it back and think about it is like you're localizing the supply and demand balance of energy. So, if you don't understand the network constraints or the voltage stability, more technical terms, essentially rather than supply and demand being you're the demand at home in, some portion of some city and the power plant is, 400 kilometers away in a regional center where they can build it, and you have to transmit that energy to power your home. Instead, now it's becoming more localized. So you have the generation and consumption a lot closer together. So therefore, you can theoretically avoid investing in those massive power lines to bring the big energy from a further away power station to your local area because it's all there. Therefore, the grid is more resilient locally.
I think that localization analogy for that supply demand equation is a really good way of thinking about it.
And you guys talked about the supply and demand balance a lot in the last energy series episode, so I think that this should build on quite well from that. Yeah,
for more detail, the previous episode that we went through explains a lot of this stuff. But I think simplifying it down to that is a really good way of, kind of just a quick summary of it. Just a quick intermission. Thanks so much for listening. If we could just ask a quick favor, if you could send this to a friend and recommend it, we would greatly appreciate it. It's easy to do and it helps the show out. Thanks. So I guess in terms of broader environmental benefits, what are they in terms of participating in a VPP?
Yeah, so there's a few different things here. I suppose a VPP, in its essence, is trying to make the best use of the resources that are already there and all the little resources. So, of course, the energy in a VPP is typically located on your premises, and the most common form of that is solar. So it promotes the use of renewable energy and using it really effectively rather than it being consumed and spilled out to the grid where nobody has a use for it, and then the price goes really low, and the network imbalances threaten the stability of the grid. So it promotes the usage and consumption of that cheap, free solar power. It avoids having to build too much, for example, what we talked about just before in terms of network investment, but I'll talk about the bigger power plants in a second. And then it just adds value to these technologies that we're already installing. So, for example, home batteries, sure, they could be good for backup power. So if in the event that the broader grid went down, you have backup power. But now these batteries can be used to shift energy to when you need it most. It can be used to shift energy to cost you less to buy your electricity. It can be used to support the grid or support the network around you in the event of a blackout or a network issue. So there's all of those things that you can add value or stack these value, the value from these different technologies. And the final idea, the big broad one is, you could, like, the dream and the theory of these things is with all of these aggregated technologies, you can prevent the need to build a big power plant. And typically, for example, around the world, we talked about it a few episodes ago, more than 50% in major economies of big generation is fossil fuel based. So in terms of environmentally, if you're using more solar and more local generation, and rather than building new coal or gas plant, in some cases they're required, but in some cases you can save a lot of money and inherent emissions by developing and using these VPPs.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is kind of the renewable dream that's always kind of existed, right? Is like, let's just throw solar and wind at it and then surely we can figure something out. And this is kind of like potentially solution is let's have VPPs where we're able to use that energy generation and really like stabilize a grid and actually have something work. And obviously there's a lot more complexity to it under the surface. But that kind of is, as you said, like that's the dream. That would be the ideal scenario for these things.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of work to go, but it is worthwhile, and there's a huge opportunity there in terms of actually squeezing everything you can out of, all the solar energy that's out there, because it can either be detrimental or there's a huge opportunity like this to make it really constructive.
Yeah.
So talking about that, this is topical. So, how do virtual power plants or these consumer energy resources, these solar and batteries and other things, actually change the market? Like, how do you see it playing out?
Yeah, so if you want more information on the market, the previous episode within this energy series was covering the market, which potentially could help contextually. But I'll try and keep it really simple. So one of the big things is that the forecast from market participants across the board is that this area is going to continue to grow massively. Yep. That is, it's pretty obvious to us. The growth trajectory has been continuing trending upward, and it will continue to be that way until, eventually we find that top of the S curve, I imagine. So yeah, I think there are kind of predictions on what dispatchable capacity will look like out all the way until 2050, and the accuracy of those is questionable.
Uncertain.
It's hard. Yeah, it's uncertain. It's hard to know. But yeah, we definitely know that it will continue to grow, and that means that it will affect things in the market, right? And something that we've seen recently, probably only within the last 5 years really, is that in Australia at least, household solar or rooftop solar collectively has become the biggest generation source. So that is, the potential for capacity, but that's so peak demand, peak production, but that's a crazy concept. Is that we have huge coal power stations, and actually our biggest generation is coming from people's collective solar generation off their roof, right? And that has really affected the grid in terms of prices, in terms of fluctuations in grid frequency, in all kinds of things. And we predict the same thing will happen with these. It might be the reverse. It could be that they help reduce all of this. But the fact is, it'll have a huge impact on the market, whatever it is. And that affects the end consumer. If you're thinking about your electricity prices, this will affect it. It could be good, could be bad. We'll see what happens. We'll see how they play out and how they, how well they work. But at the end of the day, this affects everyone. This affects an entire country, every person who consumes electricity, everyone who's generating, every company that's consuming. And so, yeah, I think it should be really interesting to see how it plays out. It's a hard thing to predict. But yeah, it should be a really cool area to watch.
Well, I guess like we talked about the dream before, the dream is that these virtual power plants and the flexibility that you can get from them and the utility that you can get from aggregating and effectively orchestrating these little distributed things everywhere together is that you do smooth out the supply-demand balance. You do consume more of that solar. You do enable more renewable energy to come on the grid. And theoretically, ideally, you're making power prices lower because you're consuming more of your own, so you're having to buy less from the bigger grid. But I think there's going to be a lot of challenges with that, and it could be a bit of a spiky transition. But like you said, like household solar being the collective biggest source of generation, for example, in Australia, it just highlights the potential. You know what I mean? There's that much out there. If it can be done properly, then and
especially in such a short period of time, that did happen. Yeah, so I guess continuing on talking about the future and the really exciting stuff, if we kind of look at innovation and trends and whatnot, what future advantages are we expecting out of these in terms of home solar and batteries and VPPs, virtual power plants as a technology? What are we kind of thinking?
Yeah, so I guess today we've so far talked mostly about solar and batteries, and they are, two of the most popular and front of mind technologies when it comes to a virtual power plant. But one thing that cannot be ignored, and I want to focus on it a little bit, is electric vehicles. So they're everywhere, they're growing. We've done another episode and would recommend checking out the episode we did on electric vehicles. They're growing a hell of a lot, and everybody's seen a Tesla driving around, or the host of other brands out there. But the thing is, essentially, these are batteries on wheels, right? These are connected into the grid at different points at different times of the day and in different ways. But essentially, the potential is that there's this thing called vehicle to load or vehicle to grid, so V2G, where the batteries in these cars are connected to the grid, just like your home or behind the meter solar at a business site. So essentially, that just provides the opportunity for these batteries, which are about 3 or 4 or 5 times bigger than your typical home battery to discharge to the grid when there's high demand, or charge from the grid at times of high renewable production, which is really quite exciting. And I think the collective capacity of electric vehicle batteries out there, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but if you think about everyone that's got an electric vehicle, and each of those are worth about 4 or 5 Tesla Powerwalls, driving around connected all over the grid and at different times of the day, you can imagine just how impactful that could be.
That's a lot of home batteries. That's
and like sometimes they are parked at home when you need this power. So
Yeah.
You talked about the duck curve in the last episode briefly, but typically the highest demand period of the day is when people get home from work or school or whatever. And so if these electric vehicles are plugged in at that point, they can provide, ideally, a lot of that power.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a bit of background. There's 4 main things we sort of need for this to happen. And a very good first step is coordinated charging. So centrally coordinated through, for example, a VPP or another method, but centrally coordinated charging to make sure that these are charging not to add to peak demand. So that's one starting point. But basically, to make it happen, we need the electric vehicle manufacturers, so your brands, your Teslas, your BYDs, your Volvos, whatever, to have this capability, so to build it into their cars. We need a common box, so like a bi-directional charger with the right inverters. So basically that just means like something that talks car and talks home power system and broader grid. We need to make sure, and this is a challenge for the whole virtual power plant and consumer energy resource industry, for it to be attractive to customers. So something that's in it for them, and an education piece so they understand the benefit of it. And then, I mean, this is a bit of a catch-22, but some scale for industry to buy in and actually see the utility of these things. There's tons of trials going on, but, you know, the growth and competition only breeds better offerings, and they get more competitive and more innovative. So
yeah,
it's quite
because
exciting.
you can see the end product there is like, ideally, you know, you drive your EV to work, you charge it at work to help the grid during the day when there's heaps of solar. You get home, and then your EV is helping everyone, and it's talking between the grid, and everyone has a really stable grid because all their EVs are working as batteries, and everything's helping each other. But as you're saying, like there's a lot to go into that to make that work the way that we'd want it to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you nailed it, like in terms of like the timeline of a day. That's a really cool way to think about it. Just on that, to make sure everything's talking back and forth, the other thing that is a really interesting innovation is smart devices with smart meters. So essentially those, when connected to a virtual power plant, will help tell the orchestrator or the platform that says, hey, this electric vehicle is plugged in, this smart energy device, which is a controllable like air conditioning load, can be turned off at this point, so you can save energy there. The electric vehicle and the battery can discharge to provide, so it can all balance out. And you know, there is the potential for you to schedule how and when you want your power used, so you minimize price, or you do the best thing for the grid in terms of grid resilience, or environmentally to how to optimize the most renewables. So there's a hell of a lot of smarts there, but I find it very, very exciting.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. I hope it's been a really interesting episode covering virtual power plants and kind of like the future of what energy might look like for your average consumer. So yeah, thanks for running us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm super excited. And look, this episode was, I guess, to get people interested and engaged in it. If you have more thoughts, or you want to learn more, get in contact with our Instagram page or whatever, and always happy to talk about it. But I guess with that, we'll wrap up, and we'll tease the next mini series when it's ready.
Awesome. Catch you in the next episode.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. Find us at curiositycrisis.com and Curiosity Crisis on Instagram. We're on all major streaming services, so you can listen how you like. Got to ask a favor. If you got anything out of this episode, please send it to a friend. Your recommendation is worth a lot. So thank you, and catch you on the next episode.